The communication array on Zephyr Prime crackled with static as Ambassador Veltar prepared what might be his people's final message to the galaxy. Around him, the command center buzzed with desperate activity while technicians worked to boost the signal strength. Outside the reinforced windows, the sky glowed orange from burning cities where Korthic forces had landed 3 days ago. Veltar's forearms trembled as he activated the recording device. His species had never known war until the Korthic Empire arrived at their borders 6 months ago. The Zephyrians were traders and scholars, not warriors. Their defensive fleet consisted of converted cargo vessels with mining lasers mounted on the hulls. Against the Korthic war machine, they lasted exactly 14 hours. This is Ambassador Veltar of the Zephyrian Confederacy broadcasting on all emergency frequencies. He began, his voice steady despite the fear in his large, dark eyes. Our 3 systems are under attack by the Korthic Empire. We are a peaceful people with no military experience. Our defenses have fallen and our population centers are being destroyed. We request immediate humanitarian aid from any civilization capable of providing assistance. The message continued as explosions echoed in the distance. Veltar described the systematic destruction of Zephyrian colonies, the refugee camps overflowing with displaced families, and the desperate need for medical supplies, defensive technology, or even a small peacekeeping force to help evacuate civilians. He knew the chances of receiving help were slim, but hope was all his people had left. The transmission traveled across space, reaching dozens of civilizations within the galactic communication network. Most recipients deleted the message without reading it completely. The galaxy was full of conflicts, and few species were willing to risk their own safety for strangers. The Korthic Empire was known for its ruthless expansion policies and superior military technology. Getting involved meant making a powerful enemy on Earth. The message arrived at the Terran Defense Command headquarters in Geneva at 0347 local time. Night Shift Communications Officer Lieutenant Don Cooper nearly marked it as routine intelligence traffic before something in the alien's voice made him pause. He forwarded the message directly to Admiral Kate, Morrison's personal communication array with a priority flag. Morrison read the message 3 times before calling an emergency meeting. Within 2 hours, President Jack Sullivan sat in the Situation room with his top military advisors, watching the Zephyrian distress call on the main screen. The alien's description of orbital bombardments and civilian casualties struck a chord with everyone present. Earth had faced extinction threats before and understood the desperation in Veltar's words. "What do we know about this Korthic Empire?" Sullivan asked. General Ryan Pierce pulled up intelligence files on the wall display. "They're a militaristic species that has conquered 17 star systems in the past 50 years. They use overwhelming force and don't negotiate. Once they decide to expand into a region, they eliminate all resistance completely." "And the Zephyrians?" Sullivan continued. "Peaceful traders and researchers," Morrison replied. 3 systems. Roughly 2 billion population total. They've never been involved in any conflicts. Their technology is advanced in civilian applications, but they have no military infrastructure worth mentioning. The room fell silent as they watched footage from Zephyr Prime showing burning cities and streams of refugees fleeing destroyed settlements. The Korthic ground forces moved through populated areas with mechanical efficiency, destroying everything that might support organized resistance. "What kind of response did they request?" Sullivan asked. Morrison checked her notes. "Medical supplies, defensive technology, or a small peacekeeping force to help with civilian evacuation. They're not asking for a full military intervention, just enough aid to save some of their population." General Pierce leaned forward in his chair. "Sir, with respect, that's not how this works. The Korthic don't leave survivors to tell stories. If we send a small force, we'll just be giving them more targets. Half measures won't save the Zephyrians." Sullivan studied the tactical display showing Korthic fleet positions around the 3 Zephyrian systems. "What would it take to make a real difference?" "Everything we have," Morrison answered without hesitation. "The Korthic have 47 capital ships in that region plus support vessels. They've been building their military for decades. To stop them completely, we'd need to deploy our entire battle fleet. That seems excessive for a humanitarian mission, one of the civilian advisors commented. Pierce turned to face the man directly. There's nothing humanitarian about what the Korthik are doing. They're committing genocide on an industrial scale. The Zephyrians asked for help because they're desperate. If we respond, it has to be decisive enough to end the threat permanently. Sullivan considered the options carefully. Public opinion would support helping the refugees, but sending Earth's entire military to fight an unknown enemy in distant space was a massive risk. On the other hand, allowing the systematic destruction of peaceful civilizations set a dangerous precedent for future expansion by aggressive species. Admiral Morrison, how long would it take to prepare our full response capability? Sullivan asked. 72 hours to assemble the fleet, another 3 weeks to reach Zephyrian space, she replied. Do it, Sullivan decided. But make sure the Zephyrians understand that when humanity offers aid, we don't do anything halfway. They asked for help, and they're going to get more than they bargained for. Morrison smiled grimly as she began issuing orders to fleet commanders across the solar system. The Zephyrians had sent a desperate plea for assistance, expecting perhaps a single ship with medical supplies. Instead, they were about to receive the largest military deployment in human history. Luna Station had never seen activity like this in its 100-year history. Colonel Lisa Grant stood on the observation deck watching as massive ships moved through the construction bays like metal whales in a vast ocean. The largest military mobilization in human history was taking shape before her eyes, and she was responsible for making sure every detail worked perfectly. 15 heavy carriers dominated the assembly area, each one capable of housing 1,000 fighters and their support crews. The newest addition, USS Defiance, stretched nearly 2 kilometers from bow to stern and bristled with weapon systems that could crack planets. Captain Alex Turner had spent the past month running his crew through combat drills, preparing them for battles that might determine the fate of multiple civilizations. Grant checked her tablet as another group of destroyers moved into formation. 47 of them total, each one fast enough to outrun most alien ships and heavily armed enough to punch through their defenses. The human philosophy of ship design emphasized speed and firepower over heavy armor, believing that the best defense was destroying enemies before they could return fire. The support vessels told the real story of human military doctrine. Medical ships that looked more like mobile hospitals than spacecraft, supply vessels carrying enough ammunition to fight a decade-long war, and specialized craft designed for specific combat roles that other species had never imagined. Humanity didn't just build a military, they engineered a complete war machine. General Ryan Pierce walked through the Marine barracks, reviewing his troops one final time before departure. 50,000 soldiers stood in perfect formation, their power armor gleaming under the artificial lights. Each Marine represented years of training and genetic enhancement that pushed human capabilities beyond normal limits. They were volunteers who had chosen to become living weapons in service of their species. Listen up, Pierce addressed the assembled troops through the communication system. The aliens we're going to help have never seen real warfare. They're peaceful people who got caught in the path of an expanding empire. Our job is to stop that expansion permanently. The enemy thinks they're fighting farmers and merchants. They're about to learn what happens when they threaten something humanity has decided to protect. The Marines responded with a unified war cry that echoed through the station corridors. Other species might find such displays of aggression disturbing, but humans had learned that controlled violence was often the only language that bullies understood. The Korthik Empire had spent decades expanding through intimidation and overwhelming force. They were about to meet a species that had perfected both concepts. Dr. Emma Rodriguez supervised the loading of medical supplies that would horrify most galactic civilizations. Combat stimulants that increased reaction time and pain tolerance. Healing nanites that could keep soldiers fighting with wounds that should be fatal. And surgical equipment designed for battlefield conditions where doctors worked under enemy fire. The Zephyrians had asked for medical aid. But human battlefield medicine was as aggressive as human warfare. Her teams included both traditional healers and combat medics who could perform surgery while wearing full armor. They carried drugs that could keep human soldiers conscious and functional even with massive injuries, techniques that other species would consider torture rather than treatment. When humans went to war, even their medical corps was designed for violence. Captain Sam Mitchell reviewed fighter deployment schedules from the flight deck of the lead carrier. 1,200 pilots would fly in the coming operation, each one trained to operate in conditions that would overwhelm most alien nervous systems. Human pilots used combat drugs that enhanced their reflexes and spatial awareness while suppressing fear responses that might interfere with split-second decisions. The fighters themselves were marvels of human engineering philosophy. Small, fast, and disposable, they carried enough firepower to threaten ships 10 times their size when used in coordinated swarms. Other species built fighters for reconnaissance and light patrol duties. Humans built them as guided missiles with pilots inside, expecting their crews to fly into situations that rational beings would avoid. Mitchell watched his squadrons practice formation flying through the crowded space around Luna Station. They moved like schools of predatory fish, maintaining precise coordination while weaving between larger vessels at speeds that left civilian observers dizzy. The pilots enjoyed showing off for the support crews, performing maneuvers that pushed both human reflexes and ship design to their absolute limits. Admiral Morrison coordinated the final preparations from her flagship, a command carrier that served as the mobile headquarters for the entire operation. Intelligence reports from Zephyrian space painted a grim picture of systematic destruction and civilian casualties. The Korthic Empire was conducting textbook genocide, eliminating entire populations to prevent future resistance. Estimated time to full deployment? Morrison asked her chief of staff. 18 hours until the last support vessels are loaded, Admiral. All ships report ready for extended combat operations. Morrison nodded as she studied the tactical displays showing human fleet positions. 262 ships representing the combined military might of Earth's solar system. The Zephyrians had requested humanitarian aid, expecting perhaps medical supplies or refugee transport. Instead, they were receiving a force capable of conquering small empires. The final loading operations completed just as Earth's sun appeared over Luna's horizon, casting long shadows across the station's docking bays. Human ships began moving into departure formation, their engines creating aurora displays in the thin atmosphere around the moon. Each vessel carried crews who understood that they were about to make first contact with hostile aliens under combat conditions. Communication arrays across the fleet crackled with final status reports as captains confirmed their readiness for the 3-week journey to Zephyrian space. The human armada would arrive unannounced and uninvited, bringing solutions that the desperate aliens had never imagined possible. The Korthic Empire was about to learn that some species responded to distress calls with overwhelming force rather than cautious diplomacy. Turner took one last look at Earth through his bridge viewports before giving the order to engage faster-than-light drives. Behind him, the largest fleet in human history followed his ship into hyperspace, carrying enough firepower to reshape the balance of power in their region of the galaxy. The Zephyrians had called for help, and humanity was bringing them an army. The space around Zephyr Prime erupted in sensor alerts as reality itself seemed to tear open. Ambassador Veltar watched from his command ship as impossible readings flooded the detection systems. What started as a single hyperspace signature quickly multiplied into dozens, then hundreds of contacts appearing simultaneously at the edge of their solar system. Veltar's communication officer, a young female named Zara, stared at her instruments with growing disbelief. Ambassador, I'm reading 262 distinct ship signatures. The computer says they're all military vessels, but that can't be correct. No civilization deploys fleets that large for humanitarian missions. The main display updated as long-range scanners analyzed the new arrivals. Each contact showed weapon signatures that dwarfed anything in Zephyrian experience. The largest ships were bigger than their entire defense fleet combined, and even the smallest vessels carried enough firepower to threaten a space station. Are they Korthic reinforcements? Veltar asked, though he already knew the answer. These ships used completely different technology signatures and moved in formations that no Korthic commander would recognize. No, sir, Zara replied. The hull configurations are unlike anything in our databases. Energy patterns suggest they use fusion-based power systems with some kind of exotic matter containment. Their weapons appear to be plasma-based with kinetic backup systems. Veltar activated the emergency communication array and broadcast on standard first contact frequencies. Unknown fleet. This is Ambassador Veltar of the Zephyrian Confederacy. Please identify yourselves and state your intentions. In our territory. The response came immediately in perfect Zephyrian language, though the accent was strange and the tone carried undertones of barely controlled aggression. Ambassador Veltar, this is Captain Alex Turner of the United Earth Navy. We received your distress call requesting humanitarian assistance. We are here to provide aid. The communication officer's eyes widened as she processed the translation. Ambassador, their language algorithms are incredibly advanced. They learned our entire linguistic structure from a single transmission, and they're using military terminology that doesn't exist in our vocabulary. Turner's next transmission included visual data that made Veltar's forearms tremble involuntarily. The human captain appeared on screen wearing what was obviously battle armor, his face marked with scars that suggested extensive combat experience. Behind him, the bridge of his ship showed weapon status displays and tactical screens that looked more suited for conquest than rescue operations. We understand your people are under attack by the Korthic Empire, Turner continued. Our forces are prepared to provide the assistance you requested. We'll be sending a diplomatic shuttle to coordinate relief efforts. Veltar tried to comprehend the scope of what he was seeing. The Zephyrians had sent a desperate plea for medical supplies and perhaps a small peacekeeping force. Instead, they had received what appeared to be an invasion fleet from a species they had never encountered. Before Lieutenant Commander Ben Parker guided his shuttle through the Zephyrian defensive perimeter toward the ambassador's flagship. His pilot, Sergeant Kelly Brooks, whistled appreciatively as they passed the alien vessels. Those ships look like they were designed by artists rather than engineers, Brooks commented. All flowing curves and decorative elements. No wonder the Korthic steamrolled them. Parker studied the Zephyrian vessels through his viewports. They were beautiful in an aesthetic sense, with organic lines and polished hull plating that reflected the system's star like jewels. They were also completely unsuited for warfare, with exposed sensor arrays and civilian-grade life support systems that any military engineer would recognize as fatal vulnerabilities. The shuttle docked with the Zephyrian command ship, and Parker stepped through the airlock wearing full combat gear. His power armor made him tower over the slender aliens who greeted him, and the weapons integrated into his suit were clearly visible despite being in standby mode. The Zephyrians stared at him with a mixture of fascination and terror. Ambassador. Veltar approached cautiously, his diplomatic training struggling to process the contradiction between the human's stated peaceful intentions and his obviously military appearance. Commander Parker, we are grateful for your people's response to our call for aid. However, we must admit some confusion about the size of your fleet. Parker's helmet retracted to reveal a face that looked far too young for someone wearing such advanced military equipment. Ambassador, when humanity receives a distress call from peaceful people under attack, we respond with sufficient force to solve the problem permanently. We brought everything we have. The translation created problems immediately. Zephyrian language had no equivalent for several human military concepts, and their computer systems struggled to process terminology related to overwhelming force, permanent solutions, and total victory. The aliens exchanged confused glances as they tried to understand what the human was actually saying. Commander Julie Wright arrived on the second shuttle with a full intelligence briefing team. Her job was to explain human combat doctrine to Zephyrians, but she quickly realized that her audience had no frame of reference for what she was describing. Your species has never developed military science as an academic discipline, Wright observed as she reviewed Zephyrian historical records. You've had disagreements and resource conflicts, but you've never fought wars in the human sense. Veltar nodded slowly. We are traders and scholars. When we have disputes, we negotiate until we find solutions that benefit everyone involved. The concept of destroying an enemy completely is foreign to our culture. Wright pulled up tactical displays, showing human battle formations and weapons capabilities. The Zephyrians recoiled as they realized that their rescuers possessed enough firepower to sterilize entire worlds. What they had interpreted as protective technology was actually designed for wholesale destruction of enemy forces. We don't understand, Zara whispered as she studied the data. Why would any species develop such destructive capabilities? Because sometimes negotiation isn't an option, Wright replied matter-of-factly. When someone decides to commit genocide against peaceful people, the only appropriate response is to remove their ability to continue that behavior permanently. Major Tony Clark demonstrated human power armor for a group of Zephyrian civilians who had been evacuated to the command ship. The aliens watched in horrified fascination as the armored suit lifted massive cargo containers with ease and showed weapon systems that could punch through ship hulls. This is standard equipment for our infantry, Clark explained as his suits. Targeting system painted laser dots on random objects around the cargo bay. Every human soldier wears something similar. We also carry personal weapons that can penetrate most alien armor types. The Zephyrians began to understand that humanity's concept of humanitarian aid differed drastically from their expectations. They had requested help from what they assumed were fellow peaceful people. Instead, they had summoned a species that approached charity work with the same overwhelming force doctrine they used for warfare. Veltar returned to his command center feeling deeply unsettled. The humans seemed genuinely committed to helping his people, but their methods suggested a level of violence that exceeded even Korthik's standards. He was beginning to wonder if calling for human aid had been salvation or simply trading one terrifying problem for another. Korthik Fleet Commander Vexhai studied the sensor readings with growing irritation. His intelligence reports indicated that the Zephyrian systems contained only broken remnants of their pathetic defense fleet and scattered civilian vessels attempting futile evacuation runs. The readings on his tactical display showed something completely different. Sensor officer, explain these phantom contacts, Vexhai demanded, his armored bulk making the bridge deck vibrate with each step. I see over 200 military signatures in defensive positions around every inhabited world. The sensor officer, a nervous subordinate named Groktar, checked his instruments 3 times before responding. Commander, the signals are definitely real. Unknown ship types using energy signatures we've never encountered. They appear to be arranged in standard defensive formations. Vexhai's mandibles clicked in annoyance. The Korthik Empire had conquered 17 star systems using the same basic strategy, overwhelming local defenses with superior numbers and firepower before the enemy could organize effective resistance. His current fleet of 47 capital ships should be more than sufficient to crush any reinforcements the Zephyrians might have acquired. Deploy scout squadrons to investigate these anomalies, Vexhai ordered. If some minor power has decided to interfere with Korthik expansion, we'll demonstrate why that was a mistake. Captain Rachel Stone watched the approaching Korthik scouts from the bridge of her destroyer, USS Relentless. Her ship was part of a 5-vessel squadron positioned to intercept any enemy reconnaissance attempts. The human philosophy of space? Combat emphasized aggressive action and rapid decisions, concepts that would prove devastating against opponents who relied on overwhelming force rather than tactical flexibility. Contacts bearing 27 Mark IV range decreasing, reported her tactical officer. 6 ships in standard Korthik patrol formation. Estimated time to weapons range, 4 minutes. Stone smiled grimly as she studied the enemy formation. The Korthik ships moved in a rigid pattern that prioritized mutual support over maneuverability. They were designed to absorb punishment while delivering massive firepower, a doctrine that worked well against static defenses but poorly against opponents who treated space combat like three-dimensional chess. All ships execute Hunter Protocol. Stone transmitted to her squadron. Target the trailing vessel first, then work forward through their formation. Remember, we want prisoners for intelligence gathering. The human destroyers accelerated to attack speed, their crews experiencing gravitational forces that would crush most alien species. Human genetic modifications allowed them to function normally under conditions that other races would find lethal, giving them a crucial advantage in high-speed combat. Maneuvers. The first Korthek ship died before its crew realized they were under attack. Human plasma bolts punched through its shields like they were made of paper, disabling engines and weapon systems with surgical precision. The remaining scouts tried to scatter, but Stone's squadron had already positioned themselves to cut off all escape routes. Groktar stared at his display in disbelief as contact icons representing the scout squadron began disappearing one by one. Commander, we've lost contact with the reconnaissance force. Last transmission indicated they were under attack by fast-moving vessels using unknown weapon types. Vexhi felt the first stirrings of concern. Losing an entire scout squadron to unknown opponents suggested that his intelligence estimates were dangerously inadequate. Deploy the third battle group to investigate. Full combat formation, maximum alert status. Colonel Mike Johnson suited up in the assault bay of the heavy cruiser USS Vengeance as his Marines prepared for the first boarding action in galactic history. Human military doctrine recognized that controlling enemy ships intact provided valuable intelligence and psychological advantages over simple destruction. Listen up, people, Johnson addressed his troops over the communication system. We're about to show an alien species what happens when humans decide to take their toys away. The Korthek think their ships are invulnerable because they've never faced opponents willing to board them during active combat. The Marines checked their equipment one final time before entering the assault pods. Each soldier carried enough firepower to fight through a small army, plus specialized gear for operating in alien ship environments. Human boarding tactics assumed that enemy crews would fight desperately to defend their vessels, requiring overwhelming force to secure objectives quickly. The Korthek battleship Doombringer detected the incoming assault pods too late to implement effective countermeasures. Captain Zikmar watched in confusion as small human craft attached themselves to his hull like parasites, their cutting tools burning through armor plating that was supposed to resist capital ship weapons. What are they doing? Zikmar demanded as damage reports flooded his command center. No civilized species attempts to board enemy vessels during active combat. The risk of catastrophic decompression makes such tactics suicidal. His security chief, a battle-scarred veteran named Facalon, a CTIVATD internal defensive systems as the first human Marines burned through the outer hull. Unknown, Captain. Our sensors indicate approximately 200 intruders entering through multiple breach points. They appear to be wearing some kind of powered armor. Johnson led the assault through the ship's main corridor, his enhanced reflexes allowing him to process tactical information at superhuman speeds. The Korthek crew fought bravely, but their weapons were designed for ship-to-ship combat rather than close-quarters battle. Human armor absorbed their attacks while returning fire that punched through alien defensive positions like they were cardboard. Deck 3 secured, reported Sergeant Nancy Price over the communication network. Enemy resistance collapsing. They're not equipped for this kind of fighting. The systematic conquest of the Korthek vessel continued deck by deck as human Marines demonstrated tactical concepts that alien military science had never developed. They used coordinated, small-unit tactics, advanced communications, and personal equipment that turned each soldier into a one-person army. Flight Commander Amy Davis led her fighter squadrons against the main Korthek battle line, implementing attack patterns that exploited fundamental weaknesses in alien ship design. The enemy vessels were built like fortresses, powerful but slow to respond to rapid changes in combat conditions. All squadrons execute Swarm Pattern Delta, Davis transmitted. as her fighters approached the enemy formation. Target their sensor arrays first, then work on weapon systems, make them fight blind and helpless. Human pilots operating on combat stimulants performed maneuvers that should have been physically impossible. They threaded their small craft through enemy formations while targeting critical systems with precision that bordered on supernatural. The Korthik crews watched helplessly as their massive ships were systematically disabled by opponents they couldn't even target effectively. Vexhai stared at his tactical display as ship after ship reported critical system failures. His powerful fleet was being dismantled by an enemy that fought like nothing in Korthik experience. They didn't rely on overwhelming firepower or superior numbers, instead using speed, precision, and tactical concepts that made his forces look primitive by comparison. All ships implement full retreat, Vexhai ordered as his flagship shuddered under fighter attack. We need to regroup and develop new strategies for dealing with these humans. But retreat proved impossible as human forces had already positioned themselves to control all escape routes. The Korthik Empire was about to learn that when humans decided to solve a problem, they approached it with methodical thoroughness that left no room for partial solutions. Supreme War Leader Kethver received the distress transmission from Fleet Commander Vexhai with growing disbelief. No force in the galaxy had ever successfully resisted Korthik expansion, let alone inflicted significant casualties on their elite battle fleets. The humans represented an unknown variable that threatened the entire foundation of the Empire's military doctrine. Kethver activated the War Council chambers and summoned his most experienced commanders. Within hours, 3 separate fleets totaling over 150 capital ships were moving toward Zephyrian space. The largest military deployment in Korthik history was assembling to crush what their intelligence reports described as a primitive species from an insignificant star system. These humans appear to rely on unconventional tactics and superior technology. Kethver addressed the assembled fleet commanders. We will demonstrate the superiority of traditional Korthik military doctrine through overwhelming force and coordinated battle formations. Admiral Kate Morrison studied the intelligence reports from her command center aboard the flagship. Human reconnaissance drones had been tracking Korthik fleet movements throughout their territory, building a comprehensive picture of enemy capabilities and deployment patterns. What they discovered was both encouraging and concerning. They're throwing everything they have at us, Morrison observed as she reviewed the tactical displays. 3 separate fleets converging on our position from different vectors. They're learning from their initial defeats and adapting their strategy. General Pierce joined her at the holographic battle map, studying enemy approach routes and estimated arrival times. Good. Fighting their scouts and patrol groups only tells us so much about their real capabilities. This will give us a chance to test our full combat doctrine against serious opposition. Morrison activated the fleet communication system and began issuing orders that would have seemed impossible to implement for any other military force. Human ships began dispersing throughout 3-star systems, abandoning traditional defensive formations in favor of a strategy that emphasized mobility and independent action. All captains implement Manhattan Protocol, Morrison announced. We're transitioning from defensive operations to active hunting. Find their ships, study their weaknesses, and eliminate them before they can coordinate effective responses. Captain Sam Mitchell received his new orders while conducting fighter operations near the outer system. Instead of maintaining defensive patrols, his squadrons were being tasked with deep reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines. Human military philosophy treated information as the most powerful weapon in any conflict. You heard the Admiral. Mitchell addressed his squadron leaders. We're going hunting. I want continuous surveillance on all Korthik fleet movements, with special attention to their command and communication vessels. If they can't coordinate their forces effectively, their numerical advantage becomes meaningless. Lieutenant Sarah Webb led the first deep penetration mission, taking her fighter squadron into Korthik-controlled space to gather intelligence on enemy capabilities. Her pilots operated under radio silence, using passive sensors and advanced stealth technology to observe alien formations without revealing their presence. The intelligence they gathered revealed crucial weaknesses in Korthik operational doctrine. The aliens relied heavily on centralized command structures and rigid communication protocols that made them vulnerable to disruption. Their ships were powerful individually but poorly coordinated when forced to operate independently. Sergeant Pete Williams and his Special Forces team infiltrated a Korthik supply depot using insertion pods that were too small for enemy sensors to detect reliably. Human soldiers trained for operations in hostile environments could survive conditions that would kill most alien species, giving them access to targets that conventional forces couldn't reach. Package delivered, Williams reported as his team completed their sabotage mission. Enemy supply lines should experience significant disruption over the next 72 hours. The explosion that destroyed the depot was visible from 3-star systems away, but more importantly, it demonstrated to Korthik commanders that humans could strike anywhere at any time. The psychological impact of never feeling safe behind their own lines proved more damaging than the physical destruction. Fleet Commander Gaxmore led the first major Korthik response force into what his sensors indicated was empty space near the Zephyrian Second World. His tactical officers reported no enemy contacts, but Morrison's ships were hidden in the sensor shadows of asteroids and planetary rings, waiting for the perfect moment to spring their trap. Energy signatures detected throughout the system, reported Gaxmore as sensor officer. Multiple human vessels emerging from concealment. They appear to be surrounding our formation. Gaxmore realized too late that he had led his fleet into a carefully prepared ambush. Human ships attacked from every direction simultaneously, using their superior speed and maneuverability to prevent his forces from forming defensive formations. The Korthak found themselves fighting dozens of separate engagements instead of a single coordinated battle. Commander Julie Wright coordinated intelligence operations from her mobile command post, analyzing enemy communication intercepts and tactical patterns. Her teams had broken several Korthik encryption systems, giving human forces real-time information about enemy plans and capabilities. "They're starting to panic," Wright reported to Morrison. Intercepted communications show increasing desperation and confusion among their fleet commanders. They've never faced an opponent that could strike without warning and disappear before. Effective retaliation. The psychological warfare campaign was working exactly as intended. Human forces appeared and disappeared like ghosts, striking critical targets before vanishing into space. Korthik commanders began experiencing the terror that their own victims had felt for decades, never knowing when or where the next attack would come. Dr. Emma Rodriguez established field hospitals near the combat zones, but her medical team spent most of their time treating Korthik prisoners rather than human casualties. The aliens suffered from combat stress disorders that their military medical science couldn't address, having never encountered an enemy that fought with such systematic ruthlessness. "They're not physically injured," Rodriguez reported after examining captured Korthik soldiers. "The psychological trauma comes from facing opponents who seem to enjoy warfare as much as they do. They've never been hunted before, and the experience is breaking their morale completely." Supreme War Leader Kethver watched his tactical displays with growing horror as ship after ship reported successful human attacks followed by immediate disappearance of enemy forces. His fleets were being systematically destroyed by an opponent that refused to engage in traditional battle formations. "How many ships have we lost?" Kethver demanded from his communication officer. 37 confirmed destroyed, sir." Another 24 reporting significant damage. "The humans appear to be targeting our command vessels specifically, disrupting our ability to coordinate fleet operations." Kethver realized that his empire was facing something unprecedented in their military history. The humans didn't just win battles, they made warfare personal. Every engagement was designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. While demonstrating the futility of resistance, Admiral Morrison reviewed the latest casualty reports with satisfaction. Human losses remained minimal while Korthik forces were experiencing systematic destruction of their combat effectiveness. The empire that had terrorized peaceful civilizations for decades was learning what it felt like to be hunted by a superior predator. The final Korthik fleet emerged from hyperspace to find human ships waiting in perfect formation, as if the entire battle had been choreographed in advance. Supreme War Leader Kethver stared at his tactical display, realizing that his empire's most powerful naval force was walking into what appeared to be an execution chamber rather than a battlefield. Admiral Morrison had positioned her ships to demonstrate human technological superiority without firing a single shot. Every Korthik vessel found itself targeted by multiple human weapon systems, their escape routes blocked by destroyers that could outrun anything in the alien fleet. The message was clear: resistance would result in complete annihilation. "This is Admiral Kate Morrison of the United Earth Navy." Her transmission reached every ship in the Korthik formation. "You are ordered to surrender immediately and prepare to be boarded. Any attempt to flee or resist will result in the destruction of your entire fleet." Kethver had built his career on intimidating weaker species through displays of overwhelming force. Now he found himself on the receiving end of such a demonstration, faced with opponents who made Korthik military power look primitive by comparison. His weapons officer reported that human targeting systems had already locked onto critical systems throughout his fleet. "Supreme Leader, we're receiving surrender requests from 17 ships," his communication officer reported with barely concealed panic. "The captains are requesting terms for their crews and passengers." The systematic collapse of Korthik military discipline continued as more ships abandoned formation to seek human protection. Decades of expansion through intimidation had created an empire that couldn't function when faced with superior opponents. Their entire military doctrine depended on fighting weaker enemies who couldn't effectively resist. General Pierce led the boarding operations that secured the Korthik command vessel, his marines moving through alien corridors with practiced efficiency. The enemy crew offered token resistance before realizing that fighting was suicide. Within hours, the most powerful fleet in Korthak history had become human prisoners of war. "Terms of surrender are simple," Pierce explained to the assembled alien commanders. "Your empire will immediately cease all military operations against peaceful civilizations. Korthik forces will withdraw from all contested territories and submit to human oversight for future expansion activities." Kethver listened to the terms with growing despair. The humans weren't just demanding military surrender, they were restructuring the balance of power in their region of the galaxy. The empire that had conquered 17 star systems was being reduced to a client state under human protection. President Jack Sullivan arrived aboard the command carrier to address the galactic community through the communication networks that connected civilized worlds. His speech was broadcast on emergency frequencies, ensuring that every spacefaring species would receive humanity's message about the new political reality. "Fellow beings of the galaxy," Sullivan began, his words translated into dozens of alien languages simultaneously. "Earth has responded to the Zephyrian request for humanitarian assistance by eliminating the threat that endangered their civilization. We want to make our position clear to all peaceful species and potential aggressors." The president's speech outlined humanity's philosophy of protective intervention, explaining that Earth would consider attacks on peaceful civilizations as attacks on human interests. Any species that chose expansion through conquest would face the same fate as the Korthik Empire. "We didn't seek this responsibility," Sullivan continued, "but we won't abandon it now that circumstances have placed it in our hands. Peaceful trade and cultural exchange will be protected and encouraged. Aggressive expansion will be met with immediate and overwhelming response." Dr. Rodriguez established permanent medical stations throughout the former combat zones, her hospitals serving as both humanitarian centers and intelligence-gathering facilities. The galaxy slowly learned that human aid came with conditions, benevolent oversight that ensured compliance with the new galactic order. Her medical teams treated injured Korthik soldiers with the same efficiency they showed human casualties. demonstrating that human mercy was as thorough as human warfare. The aliens discovered that their former enemies possessed concepts of honor and compassion that made resistance seem not just futile, but morally wrong. Ambassador Veltar stood in his rebuilt command center watching human patrol ships establish permanent routes through Zephyrian space. The aid his people had requested had evolved into something far more comprehensive than simple humanitarian assistance. They now lived under the protection of a species that treated galactic security as a personal responsibility. "Do you regret calling for their help?" asked Zara, who had been promoted to communications director after the successful conclusion of the crisis. Veltar considered the question carefully before responding. "They saved our civilization and eliminated a threat that would have destroyed dozens of other peaceful species. The price of their protection seems reasonable compared to the alternative of extinction." Captain Turner logged his final report from the bridge of the USS Defiance, watching as human forces established monitoring stations throughout the region. Operation Thunder Shield had accomplished far more than its original objectives, transforming a humanitarian mission into the foundation of a new galactic political system. Mission summary: Zephyrian Confederacy successfully defended against Korthic aggression. Enemy military capabilities eliminated, leadership captured, territorial expansion permanently halted. Recommend establishment of permanent human presence to prevent similar conflicts in the future. The transformation was complete. The desperate aliens who had called for help had received an army that stayed to become their protectors. The galaxy had requested humanitarian aid and received education about the consequences of threatening species under human protection. Admiral Morrison reviewed deployment schedules for the permanent patrol fleets that would monitor galactic shipping lanes and respond to future crises. Human ships would maintain visible presence throughout the region, serving as both deterrent to potential aggressors and reassurance to peaceful civilizations. The final irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. The Zephyrians had sent a plea for medical supplies and refugee assistance. Instead, they had triggered the emergence of humanity as the galaxy's dominant military power, a role that Earth seemed both reluctant to accept and impossible to abandon. Human patrols reported to control stations throughout former Korthic territory, establishing the infrastructure for long-term peacekeeping operations. The species that had responded to a call for help with overwhelming force now found themselves responsible for maintaining the peace they had created through superior violence. The galaxy slowly adapted to its new reality, where aggressive expansion meant facing human retaliation and peaceful development earned human protection. The balance of power had shifted permanently, creating a political system that none of the participants had planned, but all had to accept. Earth's reluctant acceptance of galactic leadership responsibilities marked the beginning of an era where humanitarian aid came with military guarantees, and calling for human help meant receiving far more protection than anyone had ever imagined possible.